At the place where the Kanawha River meets the Ohio River, the water does something specific and visible. Two wide currents arrive from different directions, the Kanawha coming in from the east, carrying the drainage of the mountains behind it, and the Ohio already broad and moving when it receives that second body of water. And for a moment, if the light is right and the surface is calm enough, the two streams are distinct, different colors sometimes, different temperatures, which the water holds as separate textures before the mixing pulls them together. Then they become one river, moving west, and the distinction dissolves into the single long body of water that will carry everything downstream toward the Mississippi and eventually the Gulf. Point Pleasant, West Virginia, sits precisely at that point of meeting. The town was built at the confluence, which is to say it was built at a geography that makes a certain kind of sense, a place where two things join, where the land narrows between them, where anyone moving by water along either route must pass through this particular location or go a considerable distance out of their way to avoid it. Standing at the confluence in the late afternoon, with the light dropping and the far bank of the Ohio beginning to blur into shadow, the water has a quality that is difficult to name exactly, but easy to recognize. It is not turbulent. Both rivers are wide enough that their current is more of a steady push than anything dramatic, and the joining of the two is a gradual process rather than a collision. The surface catches the last of the afternoon light in long shifting panels. The Ohio side of the bank is low and wooded, and as the light goes, it recedes into a dark line against the sky. The West Virginia side rises more steeply, with the town itself visible from the water. The low commercial buildings of the main street, the houses climbing the hillside behind them, the infrastructure of a working river community arranged around the practical fact of the water below. This is where Point Pleasant was established. The name acknowledges something about the place, the pleasantness of the point, the specific appeal of a location where geography creates both shelter and access. The town's position made it useful. That usefulness drove the history of the place for more than 2 centuries, beginning well before it had an American name at all, and running forward through the colonial period, the Revolutionary era, the long 19th century of river commerce, and into the 20th century of automobiles and bridges, and the kind of small city economy that grows up around both. The Battle of Point Pleasant was fought on October 10th, 1774. The date is not an abstraction in Point Pleasant. It is a civic fact, the kind of date that a community has kept track of across generations because the event it marks happened on the ground where people still live and work and walk. Virginia militia under Colonel Andrew Lewis met Shawnee forces under the Shawnee war chief Cornstalk on that October morning at the confluence at the point. The battle lasted most of a day. It was one of the largest engagements between American colonial forces and Native American nations in the period immediately preceding the Revolution, and it was costly on both sides. Cornstalk fought with skill and under difficult circumstances, and the outcome of the battle, a Virginia victory, is understood by historians as having significant consequences for the political alignment of the Ohio Valley in the years that followed. The 2NUA State Park sits at the confluence now, on the ground where the battle was fought. There is a monument there, a stone marker of the kind that accumulates weathering over decades until its surface carries the record of all the seasons it has stood through, rain and frost, and the particular chemical patience of time on worked stone. The inscription records the date, the commanders, the outline of what happened. Visitors come to read it. Local children have grown up knowing it as part of the landscape of their ordinary days, the way a community absorbs its monuments and makes them familiar until the stone and the date and the names belong to the texture of the place rather than sitting apart from it as history. 3 years after the battle, in November 1777, Cornstalk was killed at Fort Randolph, held as a prisoner, and murdered by militia members in an act that drew condemnation even from Virginia's own officials. He had come to the fort under a flag of truce. He was killed anyway, along with his son Elenipsico. In the oral tradition that grew up around that event and traveled forward through the generations of people who settled Mason County and built their lives along the river, his death became the origin of something, a curse, in the form the story most commonly takes, attached to the land at the confluence, to the town and the ground beneath it, lasting as long as the ground lasts. The details of the legend vary depending on who tells it. The persistence of the legend does not. This is the kind of story that a community carries without necessarily believing in it entirely, or disbelieving in it entirely. A piece of local mythology that gets mentioned when things go wrong, invoked in the particular way that very old stories get invoked in places where the past is close enough to still feel present. Whether the curse is treated as literal or metaphorical, whether it is spoken with conviction or with the careful distance of someone who does not quite want to commit, it is part of what Point Pleasant knows about itself. It belonged to the town long before the 1960s, and it would be reached for again, the way old stories always are, when the 1960s gave the community something specific and difficult to try to account for. Point Pleasant in 1966 had a population in the range of 5,000 to 6,000 people. It was a working-class community with an economy built on light manufacturing, on retail trade, serving the surrounding region, and on the commerce and employment generated by the Ohio River and the industries that operated along it. The town had the character of a place that had been stable for a long time, not prosperous in the way that draws outside attention, not struggling in the way that generates crisis, but holding its own in the modest, durable fashion of a small Appalachian city with deep roots and a practical relationship to its landscape and its history. Many residents cross the Silver Bridge every working day. The bridge connected Point Pleasant to Gallipolis, Ohio, on the far bank of the river, a span of aluminum-painted steel that had stood since 1928, carrying the daily traffic of people whose work or family or commerce lay on the other side of the Ohio. The commute was ordinary in the way that a repeated crossing always becomes ordinary. The same approach, the same sound of the deck under the wheels, the same view of the river through the suspension cables on both sides, the same familiar arrival on the far bank, and the same return home in the evening. The bridge was part of the rhythm of daily life for a significant portion of the town's population. It had been part of that rhythm for nearly 40 years by the mid-1960s, long enough that the people who used it daily had never known Point Pleasant without it. The bridge's paint gave it its name, Silver Bridge, a name that fits the way it must have looked on a clear day. The painted steel catching the Ohio River light, the span bright against the water and the wooded banks. By the 1960s, the paint had weathered somewhat, the way paint does on a structure that spends decades in river air. But the name had long since detached from the condition of the paint and become simply what the bridge was called. It appears in the local speech of the period as a proper name, not a description. The Silver Bridge, the one that crosses to Gallipolis, the one you take in the morning. To understand Point Pleasant in 1966, it helps to understand something about the culture of the region more broadly. Appalachian West Virginia carries a distinct tradition in American life, a culture shaped by geographic isolation, by the particular social forms that developed in mountain communities across the 18th and 19th centuries, and by a relationship to storytelling and the supernatural that is not the same as superstition, exactly, but runs alongside the practical and the rational, rather than being replaced by them. This is a region where ghost stories are old and specific, attached to particular hollows, particular houses, particular families across particular generations, where omens are taken seriously as a category of experience, even by people who would not describe themselves as believers in the conventional sense, where the oral tradition is strong enough that stories from 200 years ago arrive in the present with their details intact. The social atmosphere of Point Pleasant in 1966 combined that deep Appalachian tradition with the more immediate culture of a conservative, working class, mid century American community, one where personal reputation mattered considerably, where civic institutions like the church, the courthouse, and the local newspaper carried genuine authority, and where the judgment of the community was a real force in how people understood and presented their own experiences. These two cultural currents existed together without obvious contradiction. The practical and the uncanny sat side by side in the same community, in the same households, in the same people, which is to say that Point Pleasant in 1966 was not a town that had no context for strange reports, but it was also not a town given to fantasy or exaggeration for its own sake. When people there described unusual experiences, they described them in the flat, specific language of people who know that what they are saying sounds unusual and are reporting it anyway because they believe it is accurate. 7 miles north of Point Pleasant, the land changes character. The town gives way to the McClintock Wildlife Management Area, and within it, the remains of what was once the West Virginia Ordnance Works, a munitions manufacturing and storage facility constructed by the U.S. Army beginning in 1942, built rapidly and at scale to meet the production demands of the Second World War. The Ordnance Works was a significant industrial installation. It employed large numbers of workers from the surrounding region, operated around the clock during the war years, and produced and stored high explosives at a rate that required substantial infrastructure, not only the manufacturing buildings themselves, but a large network of storage structures built to contain the finished product at a safe distance from the production facilities and from one another. The storage structures were concrete igloos. That is the word that gets used consistently to describe them. Domes, bunkers, igloo-shaped forms of reinforced concrete, each one approximately the same size, spaced across the landscape at measured intervals that reflected the safety calculations of wartime ordnance engineering. There were roughly 100 of them, spread across hundreds of acres of what had been, before the war, ordinary West Virginia woodland. They formed a grid of manufactured landscape that had no equivalent for miles in any direction, a geometric human imposition on a terrain that otherwise followed the natural logic of river valleys and second-growth forest. After the war ended and the Ordnance Works was decommissioned, the igloos were left. The manufacturing infrastructure was dismantled or abandoned, the workers dispersed, the roads fell gradually into disrepair, and the vegetation that had been cleared for construction began its slow return. The West Virginia Ordnance Works became the McClintock Wildlife Management Area. The industrial installation transformed, over the course of 2 decades, into a managed natural space. Wetlands developed in the low areas between the igloos. Trees grew up around and over the concrete domes until by the mid-1960s, many of them were half hidden under vines and second-growth forest, their heavy doors rusted open or sealed permanently shut, their interiors dark and accessible only through openings that had not been maintained since the facility closed. The result was a landscape of a specific and unusual character. The concrete domes rose from the earth at measured intervals through the trees, their surfaces gray and weathered, the vegetation growing directly against and sometimes across them, as if the forest were in the process of slowly reclaiming the structures. The roads between them were unpaved and poorly maintained. There was no regular human presence in the area beyond the wildlife management activities that the designation implied. At night, the region was dark in the particular way that land without artificial lighting is dark when it lies beyond the edge of a town, not the familiar darkness of a room with the lights off, but the deeper, more complete darkness of a landscape that has no relationship to the electrical grid. The igloos themselves had an appearance that was difficult to categorize quickly.
From a distance through the trees, their rounded forms were not immediately identifiable as human-made structures. They read as large organic shapes, ground-level mounds, the kind of feature that could be processed as natural before being recognized as constructed. At closer range,
the concrete surfaces and the measured spacing of the domes made their origin clear, but the combination of their form and their setting, the forest grown up around them, the vines across the concrete, the rust on the doors gave the area a quality that most people who spent time there noticed and remarked on. Not threatening, exactly, but not ordinary either. The landscape had outlasted its purpose. It was in the process of becoming something else, and what it was becoming had not yet fully declared itself. This is the area that people in Point Pleasant and Mason County referred to as the TNT area, a shorthand drawn from the wartime function of the West Virginia Ordnance Works, the name surviving long after the explosive materials themselves had been removed. The TNT area, the igloos, the old bunkers north of town. The geography was known to local residents as a place that existed on the edge of the community's regular activity, close enough to be familiar as a name and a general location, but far enough out and sufficiently derelict that it had moved into a category of places that are known rather than frequented, discussed rather than visited, existing in the background of the community's consciousness as a place with a particular character and no clear current use. Young people went there sometimes. The isolation and the strangeness of the landscape made it the kind of place that draws a certain kind of nighttime visit. Couples parked on the unpaved roads between the igloos, teenagers exploring the interiors of the open bunkers with flashlights, the occasional group making use of the area's remoteness for purposes that required distance from observation. This is the way that abandoned industrial landscapes tend to be used in the period after their original function ends and before they are fully absorbed into some new classification. They belong to the community at the edges, not at the center, available for unofficial use, precisely because no official use has claimed them. By 1966, the McClintock Wildlife Management Area and the TNT igloos had been in this transitional state for roughly 20 years. The forest around the concrete domes had grown denser. The roads had deteriorated further. The wetlands in the low areas had expanded and deepened. The specific quality of the landscape, its combination of human infrastructure and natural reclamation, its darkness, its isolation, its suggestion of a wartime past had become more pronounced rather than less. The way places that are left alone tend to develop stronger character over time, as the elements that define them have more opportunity to assert themselves without interference. At dusk in the fall, the TNT area had a particular appearance. The light would drop fast in October and November, the trees losing their leaves by that point, the bare branches giving a longer sight line through the forest than the summer foliage allowed, the concrete domes visible at greater distances, their gray surfaces holding the last of the evening light For a moment before the dark came down fully, the wetlands in the low areas would go still as the light faded, the water reflecting the pale sky above the bare trees, the sounds of the wildlife management area shifting from the daytime activity of birds to the quieter nighttime sounds of the October and November landscape. The igloos would become shapes in the dark, present but not legible, their forms visible against the slightly lighter sky, their interiors completely dark, their concrete surfaces cold. The roads into the area from the Route 62 direction would carry occasional traffic in the early evening, a car turning off the state road, headlights sweeping through the tree line, then the sound of the engine diminishing as the vehicle moved deeper into the igloo grid. The generator plant at the entrance to the area, a building from the wartime facility that had not been demolished when the rest of the infrastructure was removed, stood at the point where the paved road gave way to the unpaved interior roads of the former ordnance works, its concrete walls weathered by 20 years of exposure, its windows dark, its function as a working structure long since ended. The Mason County landscape around Point Pleasant in 1966 was, in the most accurate sense of the phrase, deeply familiar to the people who lived in it. This is what it means to belong to a place that has been continuously inhabited by the same community across generations. The landscape is not neutral. It carries the accumulated familiarity of years of daily use and seasonal change, and the particular kind of attention that people bring to land they have walked and driven and worked across for their whole lives. The river, the bridges, the roads, the woodland north of town, the concrete igloos half buried in the McClintock wetlands, all of it known, all of it placed correctly in the mental map that every longtime resident carries without thinking about it, which means that when something appears in that landscape that does not belong to it, something that does not fit the known inventory of the place, something that the familiar eye cannot immediately classify and set aside, the disruption has a particular quality. It is not the disruption of an unfamiliar place where everything is already unknown, and one more strangeness adds to a general strangeness. It is the disruption of a familiar place where the known landscape throws the unknown thing into sharper relief, precisely because the background is so well understood. The ordinary makes the extraordinary more legible, not less. Point Pleasant in 1966 knew its landscape. It had known it for a long time. The town knew the rivers and the banks and the crossing points, the roads and the businesses and the neighbors, the monuments and the fields, and the woodland north of town with its concrete domes and its quiet wetlands and its decommissioned roads. It was a community with a long memory and a specific relationship to its own past, and it was moving through the fall of 1966 in the way that communities in their steady rhythms move through time without particular expectation, with the kind of confidence that comes from knowing the names of things and their positions in the world. The Kanawha meets the Ohio at the southern edge of town, at the point that gives the place its name. The water from both rivers carries the drainage of the mountains and the valleys they have passed through, minerals, sediment, the particular chemistry of the watersheds above. At the confluence, the two bodies of water are briefly distinguishable before the mixing takes over and they become a single current headed west. The Ohio receives the Kanawha without apparent effort. The joined water moves on. 7 miles north, the McClintock wetlands were going still in the October dusk. The concrete domes of the former ordnance works rose from the leaf-covered ground at measured intervals through the bare trees, their gray surfaces holding the last light. The ponds in the low areas between the igloos reflected a pale strip of western sky. The unpaved roads were empty in both directions. The heavy doors on some of the igloos stood rusted open, their interiors fully dark, the air inside them cold and still. The trees around the perimeter of the igloo grid had grown tall enough that the domes were no longer visible from Route 62. The forest had closed back over them, the way forests close over things that are left long enough in their care. The West Virginia Ordnance Works had been constructed here in 1942 to produce explosives for a war that had been over for 20 years. The work was done and the workers were gone, and the structures remained, patient in the way that concrete is patient, surrounded by a landscape that had been growing quietly back toward itself across 2 decades without any particular urgency. What the landscape would hold next, what would move through it, what would be reported from it, what would bring people from across Mason County to this specific grid of concrete domes and frozen wetland roads belonged still to the weeks ahead. On the afternoon of November 12, 1966, 5 men were working a cemetery near Clendon in West Virginia. The ground was recently turned. The trees at the edge of the property stood leafless in the gray middle of November, their branches bare and still against a sky the color of old concrete. And the men moved among the headstones with the practiced efficiency of people who do this work every day and do not think much about what the trees are doing. Then one of them looked up. The figure appeared above the tree line at the cemetery's northern edge, large, dark, and moving, not in the manner of a bird that beats its wings against the cold air and climbs with visible effort, but low and fast and purposeful, crossing the top of the trees and passing over the heads of the 5 men before they had fully registered what they were seeing. They watched it clear the far edge of the property and disappear into the gray distance to the south. What they described afterward was a large brown humanoid figure, not a bird, something with the general shape of a man, but lifted off the ground and moving through the air as though the air were simply the medium it preferred. No formal investigation of the Clendon cemetery encounter was conducted at the time. The 5 men told people what they had seen. The account was noted. It was recorded much later, when investigators began working backward through the sequence of events that accumulated across the following year, and placing the November 12th encounter at the beginning of that sequence. It was not the only account that would come out of Mason County and its surrounding region in the months that followed. It was simply the first one that can be dated with reasonable confidence to a specific day and location. 3 days passed. The weather held cold and gray across the Ohio River Valley, the kind of mid-November cold that settles into the lowlands and does not lift. Across the river from Point Pleasant, the Ohio farmland lay flat and pale under a sky that had not cleared since the weekend. On the West Virginia side, the familiar line of the Silver Bridge connected the 2 banks in its usual aluminum gray, and the daily rhythm of commuter traffic moved across it in both directions. The TNT area, the old ordnance works 7 miles north of town, Bigiquakit igloos half buried in the second-growth forest of the McClintock Wildlife Management Area, stood empty in the way that abandoned industrial sites stand empty, silently and with the specific gravity of structures that were built for one purpose and have been carrying no purpose at all for more than 20 years. On the night of November 15th, 1966, 4 people drove into that landscape and came back with an account that was not easy for any of them to set aside. Roger and Linda Scarberry and Steve and Mary Mallet were 2 young married couples, all 4 of them residents of Point Pleasant, and all 4 of them, on the night in question, out together in the same car. The specific details of where they had been before that night have not been widely documented. What is documented is that at some point in the evening they drove north out of town along Route 62 toward the TNT area, turned into the grounds of the former ordnance works, and past the old generator plant at the area's entrance. The generator plant was a concrete structure, unused for years, standing at the edge of a property that had not been actively worked since the Army decommissioned it after the Second World War. Roger Scarberry was driving. Linda Scarberry was in the front seat. The mallets were in the back. The headlights of the car swept across the generator building's pale concrete walls as the car moved past. Something was standing near the building. All four witnesses, interviewed independently and together across the hours that followed, described it with a consistency that the investigating sheriff later noted in his public statement. The figure was large. The accounts placed it at roughly 6 to 7 feet tall. It was gray in color, not the gray of shadows or indistinct outline, but a flat, uniform gray that read as the color of the thing itself, rather than a trick of the light. Its shape was broadly humanoid in the sense that it stood upright, but its proportions were wrong in ways the witnesses found difficult to account for using ordinary reference points. There was no clearly defined neck. The upper body was broad and heavy. Against the sides of that upper body, folded against it the way a sleeping bird folds its wings, were structures that all four witnesses identified immediately and consistently as wings, not feathers in any configuration they recognized, but large and membranous and present. And there were the eyes. The eyes were what all four witnesses returned to when they described the encounter in the sheriff's office and in the months of subsequent interviews that followed. Large and round and luminous, positioned near the upper chest, or the area where a head would have been on a human figure of that size, they produced their own red light. Not the reflected light of a deer caught in headlights. That phenomenon was familiar to every rural West Virginia resident. The green-white flash of night vision behind a retina. This was different. The red was not a reflection. It was a source. The light came from the eyes and cast a faint red quality onto the space immediately around them. Roger Scarberry later described the color as being a specific shade of red, a red he did not have an existing reference for, a red that was not like any red in the ordinary catalog of things he had seen. The creature spread its wings. The wingspan, when the wings extended, was estimated by all four witnesses at between 10 and 15 feet. This detail, like the others, was given consistently and without apparent coordination across separate accounts. 10 to 15 feet is a number that stops the imagination for a moment when set against the thing that had been standing near the generator building with those wings folded flat. The folded mass of them, in retrospect, accounting for what had seemed at first like the unusual breadth of the figure's upper body. The wings opened and the figure lifted and the car was moving. Roger Scarberry turned the car around on the narrow access road and headed south on Route 62 toward Point Pleasant as fast the vehicle would go. He estimated later that he was driving in excess of 100 miles per hour. The road south of the TNT area runs through a stretch of low ground between the wildlife management area and the more populated outskirts of Point Pleasant, with the river to the west and the low hills of Mason County rising to the east. And at midnight in November, it is a very dark road. The creature followed them. This detail, the sustained aerial pursuit along Route 62, with the creature keeping pace with a car moving at the speed Roger Scarberry estimated, is the part of the Scarberry and Mallet account that generates the most careful scrutiny from investigators working through the case, and for understandable reasons. A car moving at 100 miles per hour on a 2-lane rural road at midnight is already operating at the edge of what can be precisely recalled under stress. The estimated speed is the driver's estimation under extreme duress. The creature's speed is inferred from its apparent position relative to the car across the duration of the pursuit. These are not conditions under which precise measurement is possible. What all four witnesses consistently reported was that the thing was above them and behind them for the full length of the drive, and that it was not flapping its wings in the way that a bird flaps its wings to stay aloft and move forward. It held them extended and rode the air above the car for the duration of the pursuit before, somewhere in the approach to Point Pleasant, it was no longer there. The witnesses could not say precisely where it had gone. It was simply no longer visible above them when they looked. Roger Scarberry drove directly to the Mason County Sheriff's Office. The time of their arrival at the sheriff's office has not been precisely documented in every account. What is documented is that it was late, after midnight, in the early hours of November 16th, and that all four of them came into the building together and requested to speak to someone about what they had seen. Sheriff George Johnson was called in to conduct the interview. The Mason County Sheriff's Office in the early hours of November 16th, 1966, was a quiet institutional space, a government office, not a large one, in a small county seat in West Virginia. The four young adults who sat across from Sheriff Johnson that night were not, by the accounts of people who knew them, prone to collective invention. They were members of the community. They knew each other. They had been present together for the same event. And they were, in the description of Sheriff Johnson himself, visibly frightened, not performing fright, not in the dramatized manner of people working themselves up into a story. Frightened in the flat, specific, physically present way of people who have not yet fully processed what their bodies went through. An hour ago, Sheriff Johnson interviewed all four of them that night. He listened to their accounts of what they had seen near the generator building, the shape and color and height and wingspan of the figure, the eyes, the pursuit along Route 62 at speed, the moment it ceased to be visible behind and above them. He found their accounts consistent. He noted that they corroborated each other on the specific details, the gray color, the red eyes, the absence of a defined neck, the wingspan estimate, the manner of flight. He noted that they were all clearly in a state of acute distress. The following day, Sheriff Johnson issued a public statement. The statement suggested that the creature observed by the four witnesses was most likely a large heron or possibly a sandhill crane, disoriented by darkness and the unfamiliar ground of the TNT area. A large bird that glimpsed at close range in headlights under conditions of acute stress might plausibly account for some of the physical dimensions and general shape the witnesses had described. The sandhill crane is a very large bird. The largest individuals stand close to 5 feet tall when fully upright, with a wingspan that can reach approximately 6 to 7 feet. Their eyes, under certain lighting conditions and at close range, can catch a reddish amber light. These are not trivial points. The sandhill crane does occasionally appear in West Virginia during migration, and its size relative to most birds is genuinely startling at close range. It is large enough to seem, to someone who has never stood beside one, considerably larger than it actually is. The witnesses did not accept this explanation. They did not accept it not because they were unfamiliar with large birds. Roger Scarberry, in particular, was described by people who knew him as someone with practical knowledge of the rural landscape, but because certain specific details of their account did not map onto the sandhill crane in ways they found remotely adequate. A sandhill crane stands close to 5 feet tall. The figure near the generator building was estimated at 6 to 7. A sandhill crane's eyes in headlights produce a reflected amber adjacent glow. The eyes the four witnesses described were self-luminous and specifically red, and a sandhill crane at top speed achieves flight velocities of perhaps 35 to 40 miles per hour. The creature above Route 62 had kept pace with a car the driver estimated was moving at 100 miles per hour without flapping its wings. These were the distances between the official explanation and the witness's account. Sheriff Johnson's Sandhill Crane answer addressed the question of what a person might mistake for something large and strange near the generator building. It did not address the red eyes that seemed to produce their own light. It did not address the sustained vehicle pursuit at triple the speed of any known bird. The witnesses knew what they had seen, or believed they did, and the Sandhill Crane did not account for enough of it. The Point Pleasant Register ran the first press account of the Scarberry and Mallet sighting on November 16th. The story appeared in print on the front page in a town where four of its own residents had walked into the sheriff's office the night before and described something near the TNT area that none of them could explain. The Register ran the account of what the witnesses had reported and the sheriff's response. Other papers in the region and beyond picked up the story through the wire services. Somewhere in that process of transmission through wire copy and editorial rooms, a word was attached to the thing the four witnesses had described. They themselves had not used it. Their accounts described a large gray humanoid figure with massive wings and red eyes. The name that appeared in the newspaper coverage, attributed by most accounts to a copy editor or headline writer working under deadline and with the Batman television series, presumably somewhere in the background of the cultural moment, was Mothman. It is worth attending to what that naming did and did not do. It did not change what the Scarberry and Mallet witnesses had reported seeing. It did not resolve the question of what was standing near the generator building in the early hours of November 16th, 1966. What it did was give the thing a fixed word that could travel, a word that carried, embedded in its two syllables, both the physical quality that had most impressed the witnesses, the wings, large and spread, and utterly unlike anything familiar, and a cultural register that was, in 1966, saturated with the specific imagery of a costumed flying figure operating at night in a city full of people who did not notice him until he was above them. The name attached, Mothman. By the time the Associated Press had carried the story across the wire network, the word had become the universal referent for whatever had been standing near the old generator building in the TNT area on the night of November 15th. The witness's own descriptive language, the gray figure, the red eyes, the folded wings, had been subsumed into a name that carried its own mythology already built in, borrowed from another context and repurposed for this one. Roger and Linda Scarberry and Steve and Mary Mallet used the name in the months that followed, as everyone did. It had become the available word. It was the word by which other people understood what they were talking about when they described what had happened on Route 62. The Clendenin encounter on November 12th had not been reported widely. The five gravediggers had described what they saw to the people around them, but the account had not moved through regional press coverage in the way the Scarberry sighting did. The Clendenin account was gathered later in the process of working backward through the timeline. What made the Scarberry and Mallet encounter the anchor of the documented sequence was not merely its content, though the content was striking enough, but the formal weight of the reporting that followed it. Four named witnesses, a formal interview with the county sheriff, a statement issued for the record, a newspaper account on November 16th, an official explanation offered and contested. These were the elements that gave the account a shape that could be examined and returned to, Sheriff Johnson had listened carefully to all four of them and had tried to offer a framework that kept the event inside the familiar. The Sandhill Crane was not an absurd suggestion. It was a reasonable reach toward the available explanations, offered in good faith by an official whose responsibility was to make sense of what his community's residents were reporting. He was not dismissing the witnesses. He was trying to provide something useful in a situation where nothing obviously useful was available. The four witnesses were not the kind of people who set out to create a story. The accounts given to the sheriff in the early hours of November 16th, the accounts given to journalists in the days that followed, and the accounts given to researchers over the following months were not accounts that shifted toward the dramatic with retelling. They stayed close to the specific physical details of the encounter as the witnesses had experienced it. The gray, the red, the wings folded and then spread, the speed above Route 62, the cessation of the pursuit somewhere in the approach to town. These details held in the accounts over time, without the kind of elaboration that tends to mark testimony that is being constructed rather than recalled. What Sheriff Johnson's explanation did not account for held its shape in the record, too. The Sandhill Crane, offered on November 16th, remained in the documented file of this case alongside the witnesses' accounts, two frameworks sitting at a particular, unresolved distance from each other, neither displacing the other from the record. The sheriff's explanation is there. The witness's report is there. The distance between them is there. That distance is not something the official investigation of November 1966 was designed to close. It was not something any authority in Mason County had the tools to close, given the nature of what was being described and the absence of any physical evidence from the TNT area that could be independently examined. The creature had not left feathers. It had not left tracks that were confirmed and documented by investigators. The old generator building had not recorded anything. The road south to Point Pleasant had recorded nothing. There was the car, and there were four people who had been in it, and there was what they said. The account filed with Sheriff Johnson on November 16th, 1966, is the document the case rests on. Four witnesses, specific and consistent descriptions, a named location, a named road, a named official, who heard the account in person and found the witnesses credible enough to issue a public response. These are the bones of it. They are not large bones in evidentiary terms. They are the bones of a report made at a specific time in a specific place by four people who agreed on the essential details of what they had experienced. The Sandhill Crane answer was offered, and it did not satisfy the witnesses. That gap between what the official explanation accounted for and what the witnesses reported experiencing is a precise documentable gap. It is not the gap between the mundane and the supernatural. It is the more ordinary gap between an explanation that fits some of what was reported and a report that describes something that does not fully fit any available explanation. Investigations encounter that gap regularly. It does not always close. On the morning of November 16th, the Point Pleasant Register was on its stands, with the Scarberry and Millette account on the front page. The town had its name for the thing. The word Mothman was in the wire services and moving outward through regional and national coverage. The TNT area north of town, the abandoned concrete igloos, the unpaved roads through the former ordnance grounds, the McClintock wetlands going dark and still in November, had become a location that people were talking about in a new way, though the igloos themselves had not changed, and the overgrown roads were unchanged, and the McClintock wetlands were the same wetlands they had been the day before. Four people had driven out there and come back with a description of something they could not account for. They had reported it formally and had been interviewed with apparent care. The sheriff had listened and had offered what he could offer. The newspaper had printed the account, and whatever had been standing near the old generator building, gray, 6 or 7 feet tall, yet with eyes that produced their own red light and wings that could carry it above a moving car without effort, had gone back wherever it had come from, or had not gone anywhere at all, in the way that things which have no confirmed location cannot meaningfully be said to have left one. The Scarberry and Millette account was in the record now. It had a date and a location and a name attached to it, and it was not going to become a less interesting question with the passage of time. The sheriff's Sandhill Crane answer sat beside it in the same record, patient and ordinary and genuinely well-intentioned. Whether the Crane answer fit everything those 4 people had described in the early hours of that cold November morning in the Mason County Sheriff's Office, whether it accounted for the red eyes and the speed and the sustained pursuit and the wingspan that opened like something out of a bat category that did not yet have a name, is a question the record preserves without answering. The witnesses said it did not fit. The sheriff offered it anyway, as an official in a position that required him to offer something. Both of these things are in the file, sitting quietly at the distance that has separated them for more than 50 years. That distance remains the same distance it was in November of 1966. Nothing that has been investigated or published or examined in the decades since has closed it in either direction. The Sandhill Crane answer is still there. The witness's account is still there. The witness's account is still there. And the space between them continues to hold, as open questions hold, without urgency, without resolution, without any particular expectation that they will be settled any time soon. The November after the Scarberry and Millette sighting, investigators began comparing notes on something that had not been obvious at first, that the encounter on the night of November 15th was not a single event, but a beginning. Roger and Linda Scarberry had filed their report. Steve and Mary Mallett had signed their names below it. Sheriff Johnson had issued his statement about Hurons and Cranes, and then, in the weeks that followed, the reports kept coming, different names, different nights, different nights. The same stretch of Mason County, the same abandoned landscape north of town, and descriptions that returned again and again to the same physical details, the height, the wings, the eyes offered by witnesses who had not spoken to one another before speaking to investigators. Between November 1966 and December 1967, the researchers and journalists who covered the Point Pleasant sighting wave documented well over 100 individual reports from across Mason County and the surrounding region. John Keel, the journalist and author who spent significant time in Point Pleasant across 1967, placed the total number of anomalous incident reports from this period, including related accounts of unidentified aerial phenomena and the encounters with unusual visitors that would later be grouped under Men in Black designation, at more than 200 separate incidents across the same 13 months. The number is large enough to invite skepticism, and investigators on both sides of the debate applied it. What the number does not easily explain away is the consistency of the core physical descriptions across accounts filed by witnesses with no documented contact with one another. The same figure, in roughly the same place, reported in roughly the same terms, by people who had not read one another's statements before making their own. The location that appeared most consistently across these reports was the TNT area, the former West Virginia Ordnance Works north of Point Pleasant, with its hundreds of acres of overgrown woodland, its unpaved roads, and its approximately 100 dome-shaped concrete igloo bunkers spaced at measured intervals across a landscape that had not been actively managed in more than 2 decades. Witnesses described encounters at or near the abandoned structure at the area's entrance, along the road that wound through the central cluster of igloos, and at the edges of the wetlands that had developed across the McClintock Wildlife Management Area as the former munitions site slowly reverted to something approaching its pre-industrial character. Multiple independent witnesses, interviewed separately, cited the same specific zones within the TNT area: the generator building, the central road, the ponds, without apparent coordination in the details they chose to emphasize. The convergence of location is one of the more difficult features of the Point Pleasant sighting wave to set aside. When investigators charted the reported encounter sites across the 13-month period, what emerged was not a distribution scattered randomly across the county, but a clustering with the TNT area and its immediate surroundings appearing as a focal point, returned to again and again by witnesses who had, in many documented cases, not previously visited the area and had no particular reason to name it, over the other stretches of rural Mason County that might have served equally well as a setting for a reported encounter. The concrete igloos were not visible from Route 62. The road through the wildlife management area was not a route most Point Pleasant residents traveled regularly. The landscape was specific and unfamiliar to many of the witnesses who reported finding themselves there, and yet their descriptions of what they found placed them with notable consistency at the same points within it. What the McClintock Wildlife Management Area looked like in the winter months of 1966 and 1967 is worth dwelling on for a moment, because the physical character of the landscape was itself unusual in ways that investigators on multiple sides of the debate acknowledged. The concrete igloo bunkers, each one a dome perhaps 15 to 20 feet high, built to withstand the accidental detonation of the explosives stored inside, were half swallowed by decades of secondary growth, their curved walls stained with moisture and covered in places by climbing vegetation, their heavy steel doors either rusted permanently open or sealed in positions that suggested the last person to close them had walked away and not come back. The roads through the area were unpaved and narrow, their surfaces rough with frost. In the colder months, their margins pressed close by second-growth forest that had reclaimed the cleared buffer zones around the storage facilities. The wetlands that had formed in the low areas of the former ordnance works had no particular management and were home to a range of wildlife, including investigators on the skeptical side of the debate were careful to note several species of large wading bird native to the region. In the late autumn and early winter months, after the leaves had come down from the secondary growth and the wetlands had gone quiet under the first cold, the TNT area at night had the quality of a landscape in suspension. The concrete domes caught whatever ambient light reached them from the sky and held it against their pale surfaces. The roads between them ran without street lighting into a darkness that was nearly complete. The sounds of the highway and the town were inaudible from the interior of the area, absorbed by the tree cover and the distance and the particular stillness of a managed wilderness in the hours after sunset. Whatever had been done there during the Second World War was long finished. Whatever would eventually be done with the land had not yet been decided. The area existed in the period of the sightings, in the particular quiet of a place that has been left to its own processes and has been finding its way back to them slowly for 20 years. Marcella Bennett arrived at that landscape on a night in late November 1966, driving to the home of her friend Ralph Thomas, whose property was located near the TNT area. She had brought her small daughter with her. The account she gave afterward has been cited by researchers across the range of perspectives on the Point Pleasant case because it represents one of the more detailed and consistently maintained individual witness narratives from the sighting period. A woman who had no prior involvement in the earlier reports, who arrived at the Thomas property at night for reasons unconnected to the phenomenon, and who described what happened in terms that remained consistent across multiple subsequent accounts. Bennett reported that as she stepped out of her car and retrieved her daughter, a large figure rose from the ground at the edge of the property, not from the trees or from the air, she specified, but from the ground as if it had been resting or crouching there in the dark beside the vehicle. The figure fixed its red eyes on her. It spread what she described as massive wings, and Bennett reported that in the moment the figure rose and turned its gaze toward her, she was so completely immobilized by what she was experiencing, a state she described as paralysis rather than simply fear, a distinction she maintained in subsequent tellings that she dropped her daughter and could not move until someone inside the Thomas house came to the door and helped her inside. She remained in a state of visible distress for some time after the initial encounter, and the account she gave of the figure itself was consistent with the descriptions the Scarberry and Mallet witnesses had filed 10 days earlier: the height, the wings, the eyes positioned on or near the upper body in a configuration that witnesses consistently found difficult to describe in relation to any known animal's anatomy. The paralysis detail in Bennett's account was not unique to her report. Across the broader collection of Point Pleasant sighting narratives from this period, multiple witnesses described a quality of physical incapacitation at the moment of the encounter, an inability to move or call out, a feeling that the body had temporarily stopped responding to instructions from the mind, that persisted for varying lengths of time after the figure disappeared or was otherwise no longer present. Researchers who examined this feature of the reports were divided on its significance. Some held that it was consistent with a recognized physiological response to extreme fear, in which the stress response temporarily interrupts normal motor function. Others noted that the witnesses themselves distinguished between fear, which they acknowledged experiencing in quantity, and the paralysis, which they described as a separate and more bewildering phenomenon, one that lifted when the figure left rather than when the witness's fear subsided. The distinction is one the documentary record preserves but does not resolve. The name Mothman arrived in the documentary record, not from the witnesses, but from the press. The Point Pleasant Register ran the first printed account of the Scarberry and Mallet sighting on November 16, 1966, the morning after the 4 witnesses reported to Sheriff Johnson's office. The story named the witnesses and summarized what they had described: the height, the wingspan, the pursuit south along Route 62, the luminous red eyes that all 4 of them had continued to return to in their accounts. The name Mothman appeared shortly after in wire service coverage, distributed across regional and national newspapers, attributed generally to a copy editor or headline writer, a newspaper professional doing the ordinary work of finding a label that would fit a column width and travel across a wire service, and landing, apparently, on the name of the caped villain, then appearing weekly in the Batman television series, which had begun its run on ABC in January 1966 and was at the peak of its popularity in the autumn of the same year. The name Mothman replaced the descriptive language the witnesses had used. Roger Scarberry had described a large gray figure with wings and red eyes. Linda Scarberry had described a humanoid shape, broad across the chest, taller than a man. The Malletets had used similar language, reaching for comparisons that didn't quite hold, and then discarding them. What the witnesses were trying to describe was something for which they did not have an existing name, and the name they were given by the press was adopted because language does not tolerate vacuums, and the press cannot afford to wait for better terminology. Mothman was not a description, it was a convenience. It attached itself to the phenomenon permanently, the way names do when they arrive early enough in the life of a story that there is nothing yet competing with them. The adoption of the Mothman name by the national press brought a wave of attention to Point Pleasant that the community experienced with considerable ambivalence. The sightings were discussed at dinner tables and in diners, at churches, and at the Mason County Courthouse, with the full range of opinion available in a small conservative town confronted with something it had not anticipated and could not easily place. Some residents were certain the whole business was misidentification. Herons and owls enlarged by darkness and fear, barn owls whose widespread wings and forward-facing eyes could, under specific conditions, and to a startled driver on an unlit road, produce an impression that bore some general resemblance to what witnesses described. Others were certain something was being dismissed too quickly, that the witnesses were too numerous and too consistent and too reluctant to have made it all up, or to have all been confused at once in the same direction. The skeptical explanations offered during the sighting wave were taken seriously by investigators and documented as part of the record. A sandhill crane, the explanation Sheriff Johnson had offered after the Scarberry and Millette report, can stand 4 feet tall, has a wingspan reaching up to 6 feet, and is capable of flight at speeds exceeding 35 miles per hour. In poor light or at unusual angles, a sandhill crane could plausibly be misidentified by a startled witness, and witnesses driving quickly on an unlit road at night would have limited time and limited conditions in which to assess what they were observing. The barn owl presents similar possibilities on a smaller scale, a large barn owl seen at close range in headlights, its pale face and forward-facing eyes reflecting the light, its wing posture at the moment of takeoff appearing to suggest a broader span than its actual measurement, might create an impression that startled observers would later describe in terms that departed from the ornithological reality. The difficulty with the bird hypothesis, as the witnesses and the researchers who interviewed them consistently noted, was not with individual elements of it, but with the totality of the described encounter. A sandhill crane does not reach 6 to 7 feet in height. Its eyes do not produce a sustained red luminescence. It does not pursue a vehicle at highway speed across several miles of open road. These were the features the witnesses returned to when the bird hypothesis was offered, not defensively, but specifically, noting the points at which the explanation did not match the experience they were trying to describe. The investigation did not resolve the question. The bird hypothesis remained on the record, and so did the witnesses' objections to it, and neither displaced the other. Across the winter of 1966 and into the spring of 1967, the reports continued to arrive at investigators' notebooks and at the desks of journalists covering the story. The McClintock Wildlife Management Area remained the most consistently cited location. The figure described was, across these continuing accounts, recognizably the same, large humanoid, winged, with the same unusual configuration of eyes that witnesses struggled to place accurately in relation to a face or a head or a body whose other features they found difficult to render. Witnesses arrived at the encounters from different directions and different circumstances. Some had heard about the earlier sightings and were curious. Others reported having no particular expectation when they found themselves in the TNT area and encountered what they later described. The consistency of physical description across these two categories of witnesses, those who had prior knowledge of the reports and those who had not, was something researchers noted as significant, though not conclusive. There were also, throughout this period, the other categories of anomalous report: UFO sightings, or UAP encounters, to use the terminology that more accurately describes the reported phenomena, were filed from across Mason County during the same 13 months, and investigators who covered the broader pattern noted a geographic overlap between the reported UAP sighting locations and the Mothman encounter zones that was difficult to attribute entirely to coincidence, though equally difficult to explain. Men in Black encounters, reports of visits from unusual, formally dressed individuals who appeared shortly after witnesses had reported sightings, and who asked questions or issued warnings in terms that witnesses found confusing and sometimes distressing, were documented by John Keel and by Mary Heyer, who served as Point Pleasant correspondent for the Athens, Ohio Messenger, and maintained a detailed record of the anomalous incidents reported to her across this period. The Men in Black accounts added a dimension to the Point Pleasant phenomenon that its investigators found difficult to categorize. The figures described were not physically remarkable in the way the Mothman was. They were men, or appeared to be men, in dark suits, arriving in vehicles that witnesses sometimes described as unusual and sometimes could not describe at all. The conversations they initiated were reportedly about the UFO or Mothman sightings. The advice or warnings they offered were reportedly vague, delivered in an affectless manner, and focused on persuading witnesses not to discuss what they had seen publicly. Their arrival was reported by multiple witnesses across the sighting period, their visits logged in researcher notebooks alongside the Mothman encounters and the UAP reports, and their identity was never established. They remain an unresolved element of the documented record from this period, as specific and as unexplained as anything else in the file. John Keel traveled to Point Pleasant across 1967 with the specific purpose of investigating the full range of anomalous events being reported from the area. He interviewed witnesses directly, including Roger and Linda Scarberry, and maintained contact with Mary Heyer, whose position as a local journalist with established community trust gave her access to witnesses who might not have spoken to an out-of-state researcher. Keel's notebooks from this period are among the most detailed contemporaneous records of the sighting wave, not because he approached the material without interpretive perspective, which he did not, but because he recorded the specific details of individual accounts with care and rigor, noting dates, locations, the witness's own language, and the points at which accounts converged or diverged. Whatever position one holds on the conclusions Keel eventually drew from this material, the underlying documentation represents a substantial archive of what witnesses reported saying, in the order they reported saying it, across a period that lasted longer than most investigations of this kind expect. The spring of 1967 brought the McClintock wetlands back into their seasonal character, the ponds filling with snowmelt and spring rain, the second-growth forest thickening around the concrete igloos, the bird populations returning to the wildlife management area in the numbers that made it a recognized destination for naturalists from the surrounding counties. The Mothman reports continued through the spring and into the summer, neither accelerating nor subsiding in any pattern that investigators were able to associate with seasonal change or any other external variable. Witnesses described the same figure in the same landscape with the same physical details across all seasons of the year, and the accounts filed in July had the same general character as those filed in November and March. The landscape of the TNT area was different in each season, the bare concrete of the igloos visible through leafless trees in winter, obscured by dense green canopy in summer, but the figure described did not vary with the landscape's changes. By the autumn of 1967, the Point Pleasant Mothman sighting wave had been ongoing for nearly a year. The town had absorbed the national attention that followed the initial press coverage, had watched reporters and investigators and the curious arrive and depart, had continued its ordinary functions as a working-class river community with a conservative civic culture and a deep regional tradition of taking seriously the things that happened at the edges of ordinary experience. The sightings were part of the landscape of the year, in the way that prolonged unusual events become part of the landscape of a community, not forgotten, not resolved, present in conversations and in the unspoken register of a place that knows something is happening in its vicinity that it cannot fully account for. The regional legend of Cornstalk's curse, the tradition attached to the murder of the Shawnee chief at Fort Randolph in November 1777, more than 2 centuries before the sighting wave began, was invoked by some residents during this period as a frame for what was happening. The curse narrative is part of Point Pleasant's documented cultural inheritance, maintained in local storytelling across generations, and referenced at the 2 Endy Way State Park monument that marks the site of the 1774 battle near the river's edge. Whether the residents who invoked it during the Mothman period did so with full literal belief, or with the qualified conviction of people reaching for an existing framework to hold an experience that resisted newer ones, is not something the documentary record can establish with certainty. What the record does show is that the curse narrative and the Mothman phenomenon existed in the same cultural space, available to the same community across the same months. The summer pond at the center of the McClintock Wildlife Management Area held its reflection of the sky through the long warm evenings of 1967, the second growth forest around it pressing close, the rusting infrastructure of the former ordnance works showing at the edges of the tree line where the clearing crews had not reached, the sounds of the wildlife that had moved back into the area, filling the silence that the munitions workers had left behind 20 years earlier. Witnesses who reported encounters near the ponds described the water as still. They described the surrounding forest as quiet in the particular way that a forest goes quiet when something large and unidentified is moving through it, the birds pausing, the ambient sound dropping away, the quality of the air changing in a manner that witnesses reached for words to describe, and then found that the words they had were not quite equal to what they were trying to convey. That quality of incomplete description runs through the Point Pleasant accounts with a consistency that is itself worth noting. Witnesses were not, as a general pattern, people who reached easily for dramatic language or who appeared to be performing the experience for an audience. The Scarberrys and the Malatettes were young married adults with established lives in Mason County who filed a report at a sheriff's office in the early hours of the morning, which is not the behavior of people seeking attention. Marcella Bennett described an encounter she found bewildering and distressing and maintained the same account across subsequent tellings, which is what genuinely disorienting experiences tend to produce. The gravediggers near Clendenin, who reported the earliest encounter in the sequence, were 5 men at work in a cemetery on a November afternoon, whose explanation for looking up was that something made them look up, which is not a dramatic claim. The witnesses, read across the full file, are unremarkable people by the standard measures, not prone to exaggeration in their documented lives, not connected to one another in ways that would make coordination plausible, not obviously served by the accounts they gave. The documented record from the 13 months between November 1966 and December 1967 does not, taken by itself, establish what the witnesses saw. The skeptical explanations misidentified large birds, the amplifying effects of darkness and fear on ambiguous sensory input, the social contagion that can cause a pattern of reports to develop once the first report has been made public, remain on the record as reasonable and partially supported hypotheses. The witnesses' own rebuttals to those hypotheses also remain on the record, their specific, detailed, consistent objections to the proposed explanations, pointing to the elements of their described experience that the available explanations did not account for. Both sets of evidence are real. Neither has displaced the other. The case file closes at the edge of December 1967 in a state of productive unresolution that subsequent investigation has not substantially changed. The concrete igloo bunkers of the TNT area stand in the McClintock Wildlife Management Area today, much as they stood in the winter months of 1966 and 1967, when the reports were coming in from across Mason County, and the investigators' notebooks were filling with names and dates and descriptions of the same figure at the same locations across a landscape that had been built for one purpose, abandoned, and left to become something else. The dome shapes are lower against the frost-pale ground in December, the curves of the concrete visible through the bare trees, in the manner of things that the summer vegetation has been briefly concealing and the winter has briefly revealed. The wetlands in the McClintock area go quiet in the cold months, the birds gone or roosted, the ponds glazed at their edges, the second-growth forest holding the silence of a landscape in which nothing with warm blood is moving unless it has somewhere specific to be. The roads through the TNT area are still unpaved in the sections where they were unpaved in 1966. The igloo bunkers are still standing, not all of them, but many of them, their concrete surfaces weathered over 60 years of West Virginia winters into the particular gray of old industrial material that has been exposed to a long time and absorbed it. The cleared zones around the bunkers are still returning to forest at the pace that cleared zones return to forest when the clearing stops and the trees are given decades to proceed. The area is still managed, to the degree that it is managed at all, as a wildlife refuge. The herons and cranes and owls that investigators cited as possible explanations for what witnesses described, still present in the landscape, still moving at dusk through the bare tree lines around the ponds, still briefly and ambiguously visible in headlights on a dark road for anyone who happens to be on one after sunset. Whatever the McClintock Wildlife Management Area was across those 13 months, whether it was a landscape in which ordinary wildlife was generating extraordinary misidentification on a sustained and unprecedented scale, or whether it was something more difficult to account for. It is the same landscape now. The igloos have been there for 80 years. The wetlands have been there since the Army stopped pumping them out. The forest is older and denser than it was in 1966, but it covers the same ground, holds the same domes within it, and goes quiet at the same hour in December when the light drops below the tree line and the day ends. It is still there. The bunkers are still standing in the frost-pale ground, the trees pressing close around them, the McClintock wetlands spreading away into the dark on all sides, the landscape going still in the particular way that an overgrown place goes still at the end of a winter day, not empty, but quiet, as if whatever uses the space at night has not yet arrived, or has arrived and is waiting, and the ground between the concrete domes holds the cold and the dark in equal measure, patient with both, indifferent to the season and to the questions that have been asked about it across more than half a century of careful and unfinished investigation. On May 26, 1928, the first vehicle to cross the Silver Bridge from Point Pleasant into Gallipolis rolled onto a deck that had never been driven on before. The aluminum paint was fresh. The chains were taut and clean in the morning light, catching the reflection of the Ohio River below in small bright intervals along their length. The bridge had taken roughly a year to build, and the people who had watched it go up across the water, who had watched the towers rise and the chains be drawn into position, and the deck sections lifted and fixed in place, were standing on both banks of the river that morning to see it opened, and what they were watching was, among other things, the first bridge to span the Ohio River at this particular point in its long passage south and west toward the Mississippi. The formal name was the Point Pleasant Bridge. The name that stayed was simpler. The aluminum paint gave the structure a pale, distinctive brightness against the gray and green of the river landscape, and someone called it the Silver Bridge, and it remained the Silver Bridge for the 39 years it stood. The company that designed it was the J.E. Ed, of Grainer Company, and the design they produced was distinctive enough that the Silver Bridge represented something genuinely new among American suspension bridges of its era. Conventional suspension bridges of the period distributed the weight of the deck and everything on it across many parallel wire cables, each one contributing to the total load capacity of the structure, a system of distributed redundancy in which the failure of any single element would be partially absorbed by the elements around it. The Silver Bridge did not work this way. Its load was carried by two chains, one on each side of the deck, each chain composed of large flat steel bars connected end to end by steel pins passing through holes bored at each end of each bar. These flat bars were the I-bar links, and they were made from high-strength heat-treated carbon steel, and there were hundreds of them in the two chains that held the bridge up across the Ohio River from 1928 until December 1967. The system was efficient. It was also in a way that would not be understood until after the fact, entirely without redundancy. Two chains, each chain a single continuous line of connected links. If any one link failed, there was nothing to take its load, the deck it supported, and every vehicle on it would follow that failed link into the river. This was not understood as a risk at the time of design. The steel was strong, the engineering was careful by the standards of 1927. The bridge met every specification written for it, and passed every examination made of it in the decade of its construction and the years of its opening. What was not yet understood, what would not be formally described and categorized as a failure mechanism until considerably later in the 20th century, was the process that high-strength steel of this particular composition was capable of undergoing, slowly and invisibly across years of continuous load. The Ohio River, below the Silver Bridge, runs broad and cold and dark through this section of its course, moving steadily south with the particular quality of very old rivers that have been carrying the same water in the same general direction for long enough that the land around them has shaped itself to accommodate the habit. The river was 40 feet below the bridge deck in normal conditions. The banks on both sides were low and flat enough that the bridge, once built, was visible for considerable distances in either direction. A pale horizontal line across the water, its towers rising above the tree line on the West Virginia shore, its chains catching light on clear mornings in a way that made it the most prominent structure in the view from either riverbank. By the mid-1960s, the Silver Bridge was carrying an estimated 4,000 vehicles across the Ohio River every day. The number is worth holding for a moment. 4,000 vehicles in both directions across a bridge that had been designed in 1927 for the traffic conditions of 1928. Automobiles in 1928 were lighter than the automobiles of the 1960s. Commercial trucks in 1928 were lighter than the commercial trucks of the 1960s. The total cumulative load on the Silver Bridge's two chains in December 1967 was substantially greater than the load its designers had anticipated when they specified the steel for its I-bar links, 39 years before. Traffic moved across the bridge in the morning. Point Pleasant residents crossing into Gallipolis, Ohio for work, and again in the evening when the direction reversed and the working day ended and people crossed back toward home. On Fridays, the flow was heavier than on other days. Before Christmas, in the weeks when the shops on both sides of the river were drawing shoppers who had made the crossing a deliberate errand rather than a daily routine, the traffic on Friday afternoons and evenings was heavier still. The bridge carried it. The chains held. The I-bar links, each one a flat rectangle of high-strength steel, smooth on its surface, its interior sound, as far as any available method of examination could determine, bore the load of each day, and did not show, on their surfaces, any sign of what some of them were doing, very slowly, in their interiors. High-strength heat-treated carbon steel is not the same material as conventional bridge steel. It is stronger in many respects. It bears greater tensile loads before deforming or fracturing, and this greater strength was part of the reason it was chosen for the Silver Bridge's I-bar links, because a stronger steel allowed thinner, lighter links, and thinner, lighter links allowed a more elegant structural design with a lower total weight. The trade-off, and it was a trade-off, though not one that was fully understood at the time, was that high-strength heat-treated steel is more susceptible to a specific failure mechanism than conventional bridge steel of the era, a mechanism in which tensile stress and a corrosive environment act together on the material over time to produce cracks that begin at the microscopic level and propagate slowly through the steel, deeper and deeper across months and years, without producing any change in the appearance of the material's surface. The process is called stress corrosion cracking. The steel is under load, tensile stress, as it always is in a working bridge. The environment is corrosive. The atmosphere around a river contains moisture and compounds that act on exposed steel, as it always is near water. The two conditions together, sustained across enough time, cause microscopic cracks to form at points of concentrated stress within the material and then to grow incrementally without announcing themselves. The steel around the crack continues to look the same. The surface of the link continues to look the same. Nothing visible changes. The crack deepens. There are locations within a bridge's structural system where stress concentrates more than elsewhere, points of geometric change, points of contact between components, interior surfaces that bear load in ways that exterior surfaces do not. In the Silver Bridge's I-bar chains, the point of highest stress concentration in each link was at the interior curved surface of the link's eye, the whole board at the end of the flat bar through which the connecting pin passed. This point was the location where the weight of the bridge deck and the vehicles on it translated through the pin into the chain. It was the location where tensile stress was highest. It was also because it was an interior surface in contact with a steel pin, effectively inaccessible to visual inspection from outside the link. A bridge inspector standing on the Silver Bridge in 1965, moving carefully along the deck with the tools and protocols of mid-century inspection practice, could examine the outer surfaces of the I-bar links. These surfaces were available to the eye, and an experienced inspector looking at them was performing a genuine examination by the standards then in use. What was not available to that inspector What no available instrument or method of the era could reach was the interior surface of each link's eye, where the pin sat in contact with the steel, and where, in at least one link in the north chain, a crack was developing. The bridge had been inspected. The inspection records existed, and what they showed was what every inspection had shown: a bridge whose visible surfaces appeared to be in adequate condition. The crack that was developing in the north chain was not on any visible surface. It was inside the material, at the interior of an eye, in a location that the inspection methods of the time could not access. This is not a statement about negligence. It is a statement about the limits of what was known and what was possible. The inspection standards of the mid-1960s were not designed to detect stress corrosion, cracking in high-strength steel at interior contact surfaces because the failure mechanism itself was not yet fully described and understood by bridge engineering at the point when those standards were written. The inspectors examined what was available to examine. What they found was what was there to find. The crack was not there to find, not because it did not exist, but because no available method would have shown it. The Silver Bridge's designers, working in 1927, could not have specified an inspection protocol for a failure mechanism that would not be formally categorized until after the bridge came down. The inspectors working in the years before the collapse could not have applied detection methods that did not yet exist. The steel could not have indicated what was happening inside it by any surface sign. The failure was developing through a process that the bridge's design, the materials science of its era, and the inspection standards of its time had no mechanism to interrupt or detect. This is one of the specific ways in which the Silver Bridge collapse, once fully investigated, became an event with consequences far beyond its own geography. The engineering findings of the NTSB, the National Transportation Safety Board, which led the post-collapse investigation, were not merely an accounting of what had gone wrong with one structure on one river on one winter evening. They were a set of findings that revealed a gap in the entire practice of American bridge inspection, a class of failure that existing methods could not detect, in a category of steel that was more susceptible to that failure than had been understood, distributed across bridges and structures throughout the country. But in the weeks and months before December 1967, none of this was known. The bridge stood. The chains held. The 4,000 vehicles that crossed each day crossed and returned without incident. The river moved below. The commuters who drove across the Silver Bridge every morning and every evening, some of them for decades, some of them since the bridge had been new, knew the bridge the way people know any structure they use constantly, as something background and reliable, something that does not require attention precisely because it has always been there and has always held. There is a quality to that kind of familiarity that is difficult to describe without making it sound like something other than what it is. It is not complacency. Exactly, the people who crossed the Silver Bridge every day were not thinking about the bridge, which is precisely the point. They were thinking about their workdays, their errands, the approach of Christmas, the traffic conditions on Route 2. The bridge was below their thinking. It was the condition of the crossing, not the subject of it. It carried them, and they did not attend to what was carrying them, and this was entirely reasonable and entirely ordinary. On a clear day in the mid-1960s, the view from the Silver Bridge's deck was a specific thing: the Ohio River wide, and moving below, the Gallipolis waterfront ahead, the Point Pleasant shore receding behind, the aluminum-painted chains rising on either side in their long curves to the towers above the roadway. People who made this crossing every day probably stopped registering most of this. The eye stops attending to the familiar and the bridge had been there since 1928, and the river had been there considerably longer. The crossing was just the crossing. In the north chain, one I-bar link, the link that post-collapse investigation would designate as I-bar 330, was carrying its share of the load, the same way the links around it were carrying theirs. It looked from any accessible vantage like every other link in the chain. Its outer surface showed the same weathering, the same paint, the same general condition as its neighbors. The pin at its interior eye pressed against the curved steel of the bore, and at the point of contact between pin and steel, the stress concentration was highest, and in the steel at that point, the crack that had been developing across years was continuing to develop. The crack in I-bar 330, as the NTSB investigation would later determine, had reached a depth of approximately 0, other at city, 1 inches by the time of the collapse. This is not a large measurement, held in the hand. 0. 1 inches is a dimension too small to see clearly without close attention, a narrow gap, a surface irregularity, a depth that the fingertip could detect but might dismiss. Inside the link's eye, at the interior contact surface, it was not visible at all. It was simply a discontinuity in the steel, a place where the material had separated from itself along a line of propagating failure, and around it the remaining steel continued to carry the load as it had always carried it, the chain taut, the deck level, the traffic moving. The NTSB would find this crack. The investigation would document its depth, its location, its characteristics, and the process that had produced it. The report would use language drawn from materials science and structural engineering to describe what stress corrosion cracking does to high-strength steel under sustained tensile load in a corrosive environment. The findings would be precise. They would account for what had happened with a specificity that left very little of the event unexplained from an engineering standpoint. What the NTSB could not investigate, because it was not within the scope of a structural engineering inquiry, was the particular quality of ignorance that surrounded the crack in the months and weeks before December 1967. Not ignorance in any blameworthy sense. Ignorance in the most neutral sense of the word, the condition of not knowing what was not available to be known. The bridge was sound by every measure then in use. The inspection record was clear. The chains showed no deterioration accessible to any instrument then deployed against them. The I-bar links were doing what they had been doing for 39 years, which was holding the bridge up, and there was no available method of knowing that one of them was doing this on a diminishing margin. The inspectors who had examined the bridge in the years before the collapse had been thorough. The records they generated were accurate records of what they had found. The engineers who had designed the bridge had been careful. The steel specification met the standards of 1927. The design was sound for the traffic loads of 1928 and adequate by the measures then in use for the traffic of subsequent decades. Every component of the Silver Bridge had been examined by the people responsible for examining it, and every examination had returned a finding consistent with continued safe operation. What none of this examination had reached was the interior of I-bar 330's eye, where the crack was 0, 1 inches deep and growing, very slowly, in the high-strength heat-treated steel of the north chain of a bridge that had been carrying the weight of West Virginia commuters across the Ohio River since the year the paint was still fresh. There is something particular about the precision of that number. 0, 1 inches, that rewards a moment of attention. The crack that the investigation would identify as the origin point of a collapse that ended 46 lives and changed American bridge inspection practice was, On December 14th, 1967, 1/10 of an inch deep, a dimension so small that it could be covered by a finger, a dimension far below the threshold of any detection method then available to bridge inspectors, a dimension that said nothing about itself to any examination made of the steel around it. The link carried its load, the chain held, the bridge stood. The post-collapse investigation would also establish that the Silver Bridge's design, specifically its two-chain system with no structural redundancy, meant that the failure of IBAR 330 was not a failure that could be partially absorbed. In a conventional suspension bridge of the wire cable type, the loss of a single wire in a cable is a degradation, a reduction in margin, a problem to be repaired, but not a catastrophic event. The cable has hundreds of wires. The load redistributes. The bridge continues to stand while the repair is made. The Silver Bridge had two chains. Each link in each chain was carrying its portion of the entire load. There was no redistribution available. The load that IBAR 330 was carrying had nowhere else to go. When the crack at its interior eye reached the point at which the remaining steel could no longer bear the applied force, the link would fail entirely and instantaneously, and the chain would fail with it, and the deck it supported would follow. This is a structural fact, not a narrative observation. The NTSB established it as a matter of engineering analysis. The Silver Bridge's design meant that a single cracked link was sufficient to bring down the entire span. This was not known at the time of design, because the failure mechanism that was cracking the link was not fully understood at the time of design, and because the consequence of that failure was a function of a design choice, no redundancy, that was made without knowledge of the failure mode it would interact with. The result was a bridge that had been standing for 39 years, carrying the traffic of a growing community across an important river crossing, inspected and found adequate by every standard then in use, with a crack developing inside one of its load-bearing links that was too small to see and too interior to reach and too slow to feel, and with a structural configuration that meant no partial failure was possible, only a complete one. On December 14th, 1967, the crack in IBAR 330 was 0, 1 inches deep. The bridge was carrying the usual volume of Wednesday traffic. The chains were taut. The deck was level. The river was moving below at its usual speed, cold in mid-December, gray and wide between the West Virginia and Ohio shores. Point Pleasant was behind the bridge on the eastern bank, its streets lit in the early evening, the shops carrying Christmas stock in their windows, the working day winding toward its close. Gallipolis was ahead on the western bank, where many Point Pleasant residents would spend part of their evening before turning and crossing back toward home. The Friday rush was a day away. The pre-Christmas shopping traffic, heavier than usual, a normal feature of the weeks before the holiday, would peak on December 15th, a Friday afternoon, when the stores were full and the light was failing, and the usual commuter flow would be swelled by shoppers who had driven across specifically to make errands in the hour between the end of the working day and the closing of the shops. On December 14th, none of this had happened yet. The crack was 0, 1 inches deep. The chain was holding. The bridge was standing as it had stood since 1928, as familiar to the people who crossed it every day as the river it spanned, as unremarkable in the evening light as any structure that has been part of a landscape for long enough to become simply part of it. The traffic moved across it in both directions. The aluminum paint caught the last light of the December afternoon in small bright intervals along the chains. The Ohio River moved below, dark and wide and cold, carrying its waters south and west toward the distant Mississippi, indifferent to the structure above it, and equally indifferent to what was developing, invisibly and without announcement, inside the steel of the North Chain. The bridge was still holding. At 5 minutes past 5 in the evening on December 15th, 1967, the Ohio River was the color of pewter under a sky already darkening toward the west. The air temperature was somewhere near freezing. Qualitri. The commuters crossing the Silver Bridge between Point Pleasant and Gallipolis were the same people who crossed it every Friday evening. Workers heading home, shoppers returning from the Ohio side with Christmas parcels, trucks carrying ordinary freight along a route so familiar that most drivers no longer registered the bridge itself, only the river below and the bank coming up ahead. The deck trembled slightly under the weight of traffic, as it always had. The water moved below, as it always did. What happened at 5:04 p.m. took seconds. The bridge gave no warning in any form that the people on it could have perceived. One eye-bar link in the North Chain, a flat rectangle of high-strength steel that had been carrying its share of every vehicle to cross since 1928, reached the end of what the material inside it could hold. A crack that had been propagating slowly through the interior of that link, at the interior surface of the eye where it met its connecting pin, finally extended far enough that the remaining steel could no longer bear the applied load. The chain failed. The structure that depended on that chain failed with it, and 37 vehicles went into the Ohio River. The collapse was not loud in any way that the word loud usually implies. Witnesses on the West Virginia and Ohio banks described a sound they had difficulty placing afterward, something between a deep crack and the groan of something large under compression giving way all at once. And then the bridge was gone. Where the deck had been, there was river. The vehicles that had been crossing it were in the water, or on the bank where the approach structure had held, or in the wreckage of steel that settled into the Ohio River bottom in the first moments after the main span went down. The official count of confirmed deaths reached 46. 44 bodies were recovered from the river over the weeks that followed. 2 were never found. The collapse occurred on a Friday evening in the second week of Advent, and by the time the scale of what had happened was understood by the people of Point Pleasant and Gallipolis, the Christmas lights that had been strung along the storefronts in both towns were still lit and would continue to be lit because no one had thought yet to take them down. The recovery operation began within hours of the collapse and continued into January of 1968. Divers went into the Ohio River in conditions that made the work slow and dangerous. 35 to 40 feet of cold water, dark and fast-moving, carrying the sediment the river always carries in December, reduced visibility to almost nothing. The collapsed span lay on the bottom in twisted sections, the roadway surface facing at angles it was never designed to hold. The vehicles it had been carrying distributed among the steel in positions that required careful, methodical work to locate. The divers worked in shifts. The shifts ran into the evening and through the dark hours where portable lighting on both banks extended what the winter daylight did not provide. The Christmas season unfolded around all of this. It continued in the ordinary way that seasons continue, even when the community at their center is engaged in something that has no ordinary quality at all. There were presents purchased in the same stores, there were services held in the same churches, and there were families in Point Pleasant and Gallipolis waiting in the specific way that only the families of the missing wait for the divers to come back up with news. The 46 people who died on the Silver Bridge on December 15th, 1967, were not strangers to one another. Point Pleasant was a town of 5,000 or 6,000 people. The bridge was the route most of them used every working day. Among the 46 were couples, family members traveling together, neighbors who had crossed that span thousands of times on the same schedule. The grief of the community was not abstract, it was particular, and it was felt across nearly every social connection the town contained. And a place that's small does not lose 46 people without losing them in almost every direction it can reach. The National Transportation Safety Board investigation concluded its work in 1968 and published findings that established with considerable precision what had caused the collapse. The failure had originated in a single I-bar link in the north chain, designated as link 330 in the post-collapse numbering system. The investigators applied. At the interior surface of that link's eye, the hole bored through the steel at the link's end, through which the connecting pin passed, a stress corrosion crack had developed and propagated over an extended period. Stress corrosion cracking is a failure mode in which high-strength steel, held under sustained tensile load in the presence of a corrosive environment, develops microscopic cracks that grow slowly and without visible surface indication. The crack in link 330 was approximately 0.1 inches deep at the time of the collapse. That depth was enough. In a bridge with two parallel chains and no structural redundancy, the failure of a single link was sufficient to bring the entire span down without delay. The investigation also found that the inspection methods available and in standard practice at the time of the collapse could not have detected the crack in link 330. Standard visual inspection worked on surfaces that could be seen. The crack was at an interior contact point between the eye surface and the pin surface in a location that no external visual check could reach. The inspectors who had examined the Silver Bridge in the years preceding the collapse had done what their protocols required, with the tools available to them, and had found no indication of failure because the failure was not visible to find. This is documented in the NTSB report, without blame assigned to any individual inspector. It is a finding about the limits of available technology relative to a failure mode that the bridge's design made possible and its high-strength steel made likely over time. The NTSB report prompted a nationwide review of bridge inspection standards. In the early 1970s, federal requirements for regular bridge inspection were developed and enacted, a direct response to the findings of the Silver Bridge investigation. The collapse of a single structure in a small West Virginia town in 1967 changed the way bridges across the entire country were assessed and monitored. The 46 dead from Point Pleasant and Mason County and Gallia County, Ohio, are not named in the federal bridge inspection regulations, but the regulations exist in part because of what happened to them. John Keel had spent much of 1967 in Point Pleasant. He was a journalist and author with a particular interest in anomalous phenomena, and he had arrived in the region in the months following the initial Mothman sighting reports, because the density of accounts emerging from Mason County seemed to him to warrant sustained investigation. He interviewed witnesses including Roger and Linda Scarberry. He worked closely with Mary Heyer, the Point Pleasant correspondent for the Athens, Ohio Messenger, who was herself documenting the wave of reports and who described to Keel a series of anomalous telephone calls she received during the sighting period, calls characterized by high-pitched interference, distorted voices, and on several occasions what she described as communications from an individual who seemed to know in advance what she was about to ask. Keel also recorded accounts from multiple individuals in the region describing encounters with men in black. Figures who appeared after Mothman sightings and attempted with varying degrees of coherence to persuade witnesses not to report what they had seen. Keel published his account of the Point Pleasant period in 1975 under the title The Mothman Prophecies. The book argued that the Mothman sightings, the anomalous telephone phenomena, the Men in Black encounters, and the Silver Bridge disaster were connected as part of a pattern that the creature and the phenomena surrounding it had functioned as something like a precognitive warning associated with the coming collapse, and that the sightings had ceased almost entirely after December 15, 1967. This cessation was, for Keel, one of the more significant elements of the entire sequence. The reports that had accumulated across 13 months more than 100 separate Mothman accounts, and several times that number of related anomalous incidents, if the full range of phenomena from the period was counted, stopped with the collapse of the bridge. Not gradually, not in the way that news cycles move on. They stopped. Keel's interpretive framework placed the phenomena within what he called ultra-terrestrial theory, the proposal that certain anomalous experiences, including UFO encounters, Mothman-type entity reports, and Men in Black encounters, are produced not by extraterrestrial visitors, but by something non-human and of unknown origin that has coexisted with human populations for a very long time and interacts with human perception in ways that appear to anticipate or correlate with catastrophic events. This is Keel's position, stated as his position. The Mothman Prophecies presents it as a conclusion he reached through sustained fieldwork and the analysis of a large body of witness accounts. It is not a position that has been confirmed by any investigation conducted outside the framework Keel himself established, and it remains what it was in 1975, a serious investigator's interpretation of a documented pattern of events, held at the distance any interpretive framework that cannot be tested requires. The Mothman Prophecies was adapted into a film in 2002, with the Point Pleasant case as its structural basis. The film's release renewed public awareness of the original sightings and the Silver Bridge collapse, and in 2003, the town of Point Pleasant installed a 12-foot stainless steel sculpture of the Mothman on the floodwall near the Ohio River, not far from the site where the Silver Bridge once stood. The statue was created by the artist Bob Roach. Its wings are spread wide. Its eyes are sculpted in red. It faces the river and the direction the bridge used to cross. There is a museum in Point Pleasant now, the Mothman Museum on Main Street, which displays photographs, newspaper accounts, physical artifacts from the sighting period, and documentation of the Silver Bridge collapse. Visitors come from a considerable range of distances. Some of them come because of the film, some come because of Keel's book. Some come because they have read the original witness accounts and find the consistency of the physical descriptions across unconnected reports genuinely interesting in a way that neither the enthusiast's framework nor the skeptic's dismissal fully accounts for. The museum holds what can be held of the 1966 and 1967 period in a form that can be examined. The Silver Bridge has been replaced. The Matthews Bridge, completed in 1969 and dedicated to the victims of the Silver Bridge collapse, crosses the Ohio River at Point Pleasant and carries the traffic between West Virginia and Ohio that the older bridge once carried. It is a conventional suspension bridge. It has structural redundancy. It has been inspected regularly under the federal standards that the Silver Bridge disaster helped bring into being. Cars and trucks cross it every day along the same route their predecessors took across the aluminum-painted span that opened in 1928 and stood for 39 years. what the Ohio River kept from December 15th, 1967, besides the two victims whose bodies were never recovered, is a little harder to describe precisely. The wreckage of the Silver Bridge was removed from the river bottom during and after the recovery operation. The approaches on both banks were eventually demolished. The physical evidence of the bridge's existence was cleared away in the ordinary manner that follows a catastrophic structural failure. What remained was what had been there before the bridge was built. The river itself, moving west and south toward the Mississippi, carrying the same suspended sediment it has always carried, indifferent to what has been built across it or lost into it over the course of the past 2 centuries. The sightings, as Keel documented and as subsequent researchers who worked from his notes and the original witness accounts confirmed, did cease after December 15th, 1967. The specific cluster of reports from Mason County, concentrated around the TNT area and the McClintock Wildlife Management Area and the corridor between Point Pleasant and the abandoned ordnance works, produced no well-documented accounts in the months and years that followed the collapse at the level of density or consistency that had characterized the 13 months prior. This is documented absence, which is a different thing from confirmed departure. The landscape that had been the focus of the reports, the concrete igloos, the overgrown wetlands, the unpaved roads through the second-growth forest, did not change materially. The TNT area is still there. The McClintock Wildlife Management Area is still managed by the state. The same dome-shaped bunkers, half swallowed by vines, still stand at measured intervals across the same hundreds of acres. Whatever conditions the landscape provided in 1966 and 1967, for whatever the witnesses encountered, those conditions persist. The question of what the witnesses encountered has not been resolved. This is not a failure of investigation. It is the condition of the evidence as it exists. The physical descriptions given by the Scarberry and Millette witnesses on the night of November 15th, 1966, the gray humanoid figure, the folded wings, the red eyes at roughly chest height, the wingspan extending to between 10 and 15 feet in flight, the pursuit along Route 62 at speeds the creature maintained without apparent wing movement, do not correspond to any known bird species at the size described. The sandhill crane, proposed by Sheriff Johnson as a possible explanation in the days following the initial report, stands roughly 4 feet tall, has a wingspan of approximately 6 to 7 feet, and does not have the luminous red eyes that were the detail all 4 witnesses consistently named as the most arresting feature of what they saw. The witnesses contested the crane explanation at the time. They have continued to contest it in subsequent interviews conducted over the decades since. This does not establish what the witnesses saw. It establishes what they reported and what the most available conventional explanation does and does not account for. Those are different things, and it is worth holding the difference clearly. The Chicago sightings of 2017 and 2018 drew the direct comparison to Point Pleasant that researchers Lon Strickler and Tobias Wayland documented in their investigation of more than 50 individual reports from witnesses across the Chicago metropolitan area. The reports described large, dark, winged humanoid figures observed at night near the lakefront, over city streets, in proximity to elevated rail lines and public parks. The physical descriptions in the Chicago accounts carried the same recurring elements as the Point Pleasant reports: the humanoid body, the large wings, the red eyes, the apparent size that placed the figure well beyond the dimensions of any known bird. The witnesses in Chicago were unconnected to one another. They had filed reports independently. The clustering of accounts across a relatively short period in a specific geographic area, among people who did not know they were reporting the same thing, was the feature of the Chicago wave that Strickler and Wayland identified as most consistent with the structure of the Point Pleasant case 50 years earlier. No explanation for the Chicago sightings was confirmed. The reports were collected, documented, and published. The figures were not identified. The sightings tapered without the kind of catastrophic event that Keel had associated with the cessation of the Point Pleasant wave, which is itself a data point that researchers working within Keel's framework acknowledged complicates the precognitive warning model. Strickler and Wayland did not endorse Keel's ultra-terrestrial hypothesis as an established conclusion. They noted the similarities between the two cases and left the question where the evidence left it. The question is still there. What remains of the Point Pleasant case in the documentary record is considerable. The original witness statements from November 15th and 16, 1966, taken by Sheriff Johnson, survive. The Point Pleasant Register's coverage from that period survives. Keel's field notebooks, his correspondence with Mary Hyre, and the interview transcripts he generated during his 1967 visits to the region are part of the record. The NTSB report on the Silver Bridge collapse is a public document, detailed and precise, available in full. The physical locations, the TNT area, the McClintock Wildlife Management Area, the site of the former Silver Bridge, the sheriff's office where 4 young adults sat in the early hours of November 16th and described what they had seen, are all still accessible. The case has a geography, and the geography has not gone anywhere. Mary Hyre continued working as a journalist after the Silver Bridge disaster and the cessation of the Mothman reports. She covered the recovery operation. She wrote about the community's grief in the same practical, attentive way she had covered everything else in the region. She died in February 1970, before Keel had finished the book that would give her a significant place in the documented history of the Point Pleasant events. She knew the town and its people across the full period, before the sightings, during them, and in the quiet that followed. Her notes and correspondence represent a view of the entire sequence from inside it, rather than from the investigative distance that most of the later documentation necessarily involves. The stainless steel statue that stands on the flood wall above the Ohio River in Point Pleasant is not where the Silver Bridge was. It is close enough that from the right angle, in the right light, a visitor standing beside the statue and looking outward can see the approximate location where the bridge's west anchorage met the West Virginia bank. The Matthews Bridge is visible from there as well, carrying traffic in both directions across the same river on a structure built to standards the Silver Bridge never met. The two structures, the one that was and the one that is, occupy the same stretch of water. The river between them is identical. The statue's red eyes face outward toward the river and the Ohio bank beyond it. They face in roughly the direction that the Scarberry and Millette witnesses were driving in the early hours of November 16, 1966, when the creature they described kept pace with their car along Route 62 and then rose into the dark and did not come down again in any direction they could see. The 4 witnesses were driving toward Point Pleasant, toward the bridge, toward the town on the other side of the month that would follow. They did not know that. No one knew that. November 15th, 1966, was an ordinary evening in a river town that had not yet become the specific place it was about to become. The igloo bunkers in the McClintock Wildlife Management Area are cold in December. They are cold in the specific way that concrete structures absorb and hold the cold of the season, the dome shape giving them no surface that the winter wind finds particularly easy to move across. The vines that have grown over most of them since the ordnance works were decommissioned have thickened each decade and in December they are bare leafless stems pressed against the concrete in patterns that suggest, from certain angles, something between a texture and a shape. The heavy doors are rusted in their frames, some open, some sealed, none of them serving any purpose connected to their original function. Inside them, when the doors are open, there is nothing. There is the interior curve of the concrete dome, and the floor, and the darkness that any enclosed structure holds when the light outside is low enough that none of it reaches in. The wetlands of the McClintock area are quiet in December in a way that the other seasons do not reproduce. The waterfowl that use the area in spring and fall have largely moved on. The water in the shallow ponds is at the edge of ice, the surface going still in the way that water stills before it freezes, a specific quality of stillness that has weight and opacity to it, different from the stillness of open water in warmer months. The second growth forest around the wetlands has lost all its cover, and the stands of bare trees at the perimeter of the ponds cast the kind of shadow that only leafless trees cast, thin, multiple, extending across the water and the ice in directions that shift slowly as the light changes through the afternoon. This was the landscape the witnesses described, entering and leaving across 13 months of reported encounters. This was the landscape that appeared in report after report from people who did not, in most cases, know the other people who had reported encounters there. The concentration of accounts in this specific area, the igloo cluster, the road through the center of the McClintock property, the ponds and the overgrown approaches to the old generator building at the TNT area's entrance, was one of the elements of the sighting wave that investigators on both sides of the explanatory debate acknowledged as significant, whatever significance they ultimately assigned it. The landscape holds what it holds. It does not announce what that is. It continues in the way that landscapes continue, absorbing the seasons, accommodating the slow return of vegetation to land that industry once cleared, offering the same geography to whatever uses it as it offered to the structures that stood here 40 years before the first Mothman report, and to the witnesses who drove these roads in the dark 30 years after those structures were emptied and left to whatever came. The Ohio River is wide at Point Pleasant. It is wide in the way that rivers are wide at confluences. The Kanawha has added its water here, and the Ohio south of Point Pleasant carries more than either river carried alone. In December, the river runs high with the season's rain, and the first snowmelt from the higher ground to the east, and the surface moves with a speed that is apparent even from the bank, the current visible as a texture on the water that the calmer sections near the shore do not share. On the night of December 15th, 1967, the Ohio River was cold and fast and carrying whatever the river carried that December. By the time the recovery operation was well underway, the divers in the water had found most of what the river had taken. The current had moved some of it. The cold water had preserved some of it. The wreckage of the Silver Bridge lay on the bottom in sections the investigation cataloged, and from which the post-collapse analysis was eventually able to reconstruct the sequence of failure with enough precision to identify the single link where the chain had given way. 46 people, 2 never found. The river continuing past both banks in the same direction it had always moved, west and south, toward the Mississippi and eventually the Gulf, carrying whatever the season gave it and whatever the collapsed bridge had left in its current on the evening of December 15th, 1967. The Mothman reports stopped. They stopped with a completeness that Keel found one of the more difficult aspects of the entire period to account for within any conventional framework of the landscape that had produced them, the TNT area, the McClintock wetlands, the roads through the igloo cluster, continued in its ordinary way. The witnesses who had reported encounters continued their ordinary lives. The community of Point Pleasant continued through the grief of December and January and the long process of rebuilding something that had been torn out of its center and came through into the spring of 1968, with the bridge gone and the reports gone and the quiet that follows, an event of that magnitude settling over the town like the specific quiet that follows a long and difficult winter. The Mothman statue stands above the flood wall in every season. In December, the river below it is gray and wide and moving fast, and the wind off the water is cold, and the stainless steel of the sculpture holds the cold in its surface, the way metal holds cold completely, immediately, conducting the temperature of the air around it without reserve. The red eyes do not give off any light. They are sculpted to suggest light, shaped to carry the quality that every witness from November 1966 onward described as the feature they could not stop seeing afterward. In the right conditions of the sky, in certain low-light hours of the afternoon, the eyes catch enough of the ambient light to appear, very slightly illuminated. Ans Pifexistitu. The Ohio River moves below the statue in both directions of what is visible from the flood wall, south toward where the bridge used to be, north toward where the confluence is, east and west along both banks. It moves the same way it moved on November 15th, 1966.
And the same way it moved on December 15th, 1967, and the same way it moved in all the months between those dates when the reports were coming in, and investigators were driving the TNT roads, and witnesses were describing what they had seen to whatever combination of journalists, sheriffs, friends,
and strangers would hear them. The case has not been resolved. No investigation conducted since 1968 has produced an explanation for the physical characteristics the witnesses described that satisfies both the skeptical and the anomalous dimensions of the reports. The NTSB findings on the Silver Bridge collapse are complete and well supported. The engineering of the failure is understood. The 46 deaths are documented. The recovery operation is documented. The cessation of the sightings is documented. What the witnesses saw in the 13 months before the collapse remains what it has remained since the morning of November 16th, 1966, a body of carefully reported human experience that has not been adequately explained by any of the frameworks brought to bear on it in the decades since. The igloo bunkers in the McClintock Wildlife Management Area are still there in the dark. The vines hold them through the winter in the way that vines hold anything they have grown over for long enough. Not tightly, but completely, as if the concrete beneath has become simply the structure on which the living thing rests. The ponds are still. The bare trees around them cast their thin shadows across the ice, and the dark water at the edges where the ice has not yet closed. The roads through the area are unpaved, as they have always been unpaved, and in December they are hard with frost and quiet in the specific way that roads are quiet when nothing has traveled them recently.